Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this NLA webinar. I'm Peter Murray, and I'm Curator-in-Chief at NLA. And today we're launching our latest NLA report, Work London Office Revolution. And so after a year of successive lockdowns and working from home, this research paper provides a snapshot of London's current response to the impact of COVID on the capital's workspaces and their urban context. And it also sets out to evaluate how offices will need to adapt in the longer term. So the report illustrates thought leadership from industry experts and includes views from a comprehensive NLA Members Survey where 180 respondents talked about their experiences of a year of lockdown, of working from home, and the potential impact this is going to have in the future. So the report also includes over 100 projects. It looks at ideas coming out of those involved with the designing offices and also products that are used in the changing workplace. And it also looks at recommendations to ensure that London can support the way that we want to work in the future. As always, our research wouldn't have been possible without our programme champions. We're very grateful to City of London, EPR Architects, Landsec and WRE. And I'd also like to thank all the contributors and particularly the NLA expert panel on work who shared their insights and expertise with us. So before we hear from Sarah Yates, who was the key researcher on the whole project, I'd like to remind you that there will be a chance to ask our speakers some questions at the end, as usual. And so please do post your questions using the Q&A button on your screen. So I'd now like to hand over to Sarah, who's put in a huge amount of work into bringing this together and will tell us about the report's findings. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to present just a few key points from our research in this new digital report, and it builds on our 2016 publication on the same topic. In this presentation, you'll see just a snapshot of some of the examples of office design that are featured in the publication. And after this event, you'll be able to download the full version from our website, nla.london, and you'll also receive it via an email link. So all research should be centered on a question. As we hopefully emerge from the pandemic, are we seeing an office revolution? Well, with a note of caution, of course, in the news regarding COVID variants, and but on the other hand, many organisations returning to their offices in some capacity, if they've not already done so, it's almost universally accepted, I think, that what we've seen with the disruption to working life caused by the pandemic is an acceleration of existing trends, not a revolution. Next slide, please, Molly. It's always worth reminding ourselves that many people have considered this issue before us. The office in the modern sense is very much a recent invention, and it's constantly evolving in response to economic, cultural, and especially social needs. Workplaces are all about people, and it's the social function of the office and its role as embodiment of corporate culture and brand that has come to the fore in recent years as technological advances, of course, have given many of us the capacity to work almost anywhere. And rather than a place for process and production, the office has to be differentiated by providing purpose and experience, well-being, sustainability, flexibility, character, and as we know from our experience of the pandemic, access to high quality public space and green space are essential characteristics of good office design. Another thing that the pandemic has shown us so starkly is that the office is not a standalone element. It's a fundamental part of an integrated, successful urban fabric. And one of the things that we've seen in recent years is the transformation of traditional office estates and developments, some of the examples we can see here, into more permeable mixed-use districts with a wider cultural, retail and leisure offer. Next slide, please. So what of the office now, after so many of us have had to work at home for more than a year? And as Peter has mentioned, we wanted to capture how people in our industry feel about the office at this pivotal point in the pandemic and their expectations for the immediate future. And we undertook qualitative research through interviews with industry leaders, some of whom have joined our panel today, and through gathering a cross-disciplinary range of opinion. And that's something we really feel is important at NLA, to get a cross-sector point of view. A key element of this project was a survey of NLA members with 180 responses capturing individual views at all levels and sectors of the industries. And underneath our main research question, we had several questions as adjunct to that. What is the office for? How will we work? What will we need? Where will it be? And crucially, how do we future-proof not just against current and future pandemics, but also the bigger structural challenges, especially, of course, the climate emergency? And what I'll do in the next couple of slides is just pull out one or two of the key findings. Next slide, please. What is the office for? A critical question that many of us have been mulling over the past year. And it's really crystallized, I think, how the office has to be a place with purpose. We asked people in the survey to rank in order of priority which activities they want or need to return to the office for. And at the top of the list is in-person collaboration with team. And I think certainly every architect we heard from and we spoke to mentioned how much they miss sitting with their teams around a desk, sketching, working out a design solution. And I think what's so interesting when we look at our own industry and what's so characteristic, not just in the design professions, is this way that a central workspace is essential for project iteration, moving towards a defined goal, often not in a linear way, but by making interesting mistakes, as one of our interviewees says. The office facilitates that tacit knowledge that isn't always articulated verbally, and which you can get only by from speaking face to face or overhearing conversations, or as one of my colleagues says, the let's have a cup of tea moment. Learning and mentoring are second on the list here, and they of course take place not just in a structured way, but from actually seeing your colleagues at work. Next slide, please. We asked people to expand their response with comments, and we've got a whole range of very valuable comments coming back. And one of them, of course, is this one here, a clear call from somebody who misses face-to-face contact, as many of us do. I think we also need to emphasize, though, that this is only one end of the spectrum. We saw a lot of responses from people who found working at home more productive, who were able to achieve better work-life balance. And one of the things that the pandemic has done is brought into sharp focus not only very different individual working styles and needs, but the evident inequalities in home working for people, for many people having to work in crowded, expensive housing, the lack of garden or other outdoor private space, and lack of adequate broadband access, among other factors. Next slide, please. This brings us next to how will we work? Well, we looked at working patterns, and it's clear that the built environment sector is not much different from others that have been in the news recently, especially banking and finance, that will see hybrid working or distributed work, as it's also called, spending fewer than 5 days in the office as the next step. You'll see lots of dramatic changes in figures here statistically, but one of the ones I want to point out is that exponential shift of 55% of respondents expecting to work in their office 2 to 3 days per week in the future, as opposed to 2% before. An employee choice in where, when, and how to work has gained momentum, and effective leadership and management are going to be needed to balance these diverse demands that will arise. And I think one of the things that many of our interviewees mentioned was the need to avoid this two-tier system of present and remote, and how the office and, of course, leadership and management will need to facilitate that. Next slide, please. What might this mean for actual spaces? Well, we also asked people to rank in order of importance the characteristics needed of their office in the future. And flexibility is right at the top, as I'm sure we would expect. And that space, not just for bringing people together, which is vitally important, but also providing a range of environments that can adapt to different situations, job requirements, and working styles. A focus on well-being and hygiene are, of course, going to be essential to give people confidence that they are working in a safe environment. Location is third, and it underlines the importance of the relationship between the office and the city, showing that people do still want to work in well-connected places close to transport links and with a strong cultural offer. Next slide, please. How could this flexibility manifest itself? Well, more than one survey of respondents said they valued quiet spaces as much as amenities, the need for spaces for focused working or time out. And this brings us to more questions, as research inevitably does. How do we divide and remake this space? Who's in control of it? Will generic office fit out be replaced, perhaps in the long term, in favour of more bespoke solutions? Will hybrid working present more opportunities for experimentation in design and build? And of course, what will hybrid working, if it continues, mean for our transport and other infrastructure and the shape of our city? Next slide, please. One recommendation in our 2016 report was for more mixed-use typologies that can combine and can switch between different functions. And that's something that came through strongly in our research 5 years later as well. Flexibility is fundamental, not just within the office space itself, but within the building as a whole and across the wider neighbourhood. And the key element of this, as we know, is those third spaces that allow us to do remote working, social interaction, and decompression, as many people call it. And now, of course, we're now able to return to many of those. And we mustn't forget the need for affordable workspace, something we also flagged in our 2016 report and continue to highlight. An entrepreneurial, balanced and proactive approach can support the creation of flexible neighbourhoods, which combine affordable office space with other functions, such as cafe, retail, leisure, culture, even light industrial as well, and logistics, that serve the direct need of the local community and the wider capital. Next slide, please. So what about the long term? We face even bigger structural challenges. Brexit is one, climate emergency is, of course, the other major one. What are the measures we need to take to future-proof our offices? And some of those that came through in our research are listed here. I think the ones I want to point out around, as the first one, around the physical and the virtual. We often think of these as being kind of in binary opposition, but we need to think about much smarter use of tools such as virtual reality, augmented reality, and other AI to create truly integrated, inclusive workspaces. Focus on health, hygiene, space, and air are going to be key, of course, with biosecurity measures, natural materials, natural ventilation, lower density occupation, better and more integrated provision for active travel, strengthening engagement with the local, as we have seen come to the fore in the pandemic, but not forgetting that the central activity zone and the local centres are interdependent. And if we take all these measures together, that will help to contribute to the goal of working towards zero carbon. Next slide, please. I want to end on this statement, beautifully summarised for us by John Robertson, but also expressed by many other people. The future office has to be better than the home. And maybe that's a starting point for a question for our panel and for our audience. So thank you to everybody who filled in the survey, the industry leaders who gave up their time to be interviewed, and the expert panel who provide us with so much advice and support. And I'm sure, as this is a fluid situation, we'll be returning to this subject in the future. And now back to you, Peter.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah. And now we're joined by our panelists who are going to respond to the findings of the report, and who's going to share their views on some of the points that Sarah's raised. And we have in our panel Pooja Jain, who's the Senior Property Development Manager at Transport for London, Jeremy Myerson, who's a Director of WorkTech Academy, Gwyn Richards, Planning and Development Director, City of London, and Andy Young, Technical Director of Architects BIG. So I'll start with Pooja. I mean, perhaps you might be able to talk about this dynamic between office as home and home as office, and how the way that will impact on the way we travel around the city, and what will this mean for the location of offices in London, and then finally, how might it affect TfL's own portfolio?
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, NLA, for this research. I had a preview, like a pre-launch of this research, which was sent to me yesterday. And then after a long day, actually, it turned out yesterday somehow with some back-to-back Zoom calls and team calls, I thought maybe I should just take this report out to the park and go through the report, and which was very pleasant. I enjoyed so much before all the clouds came and it started pouring, and I had to take shelter in a cafe, and I was so glad that we could go inside in a cafe now. But what struck me was, because it was in the evening, I could, one, get a space in the cafe because of social distancing reasons, but also there were other strangers who were actually working as well. They had like a pen and paper and they were working, and it just had this little, it just gave me a little buzz, and I was like, oh, it's nice that there are other people I can see and meet, and so it's definitely quite it was good. So I think what has happened over the last year in terms of the way we have traveled is actually we've stayed locally a lot, which means we have walked, we have cycled, we haven't used much public transport because we were discouraged to, only for very critical reasons. But I think this has led to a behavioral change within us, and I think this change would remain. And actually it brings both health benefits for us and also sustainable benefits for the environment as well. So what I see is this trend of walking and cycling to grow and continue. We definitely need to make our cities and streets safer, greener, and we need to avoid, and we should avoid, a car-based recovery as well, because that's not the solution. I think in terms of the size, scale, and the location, what we really need to think is, what is the purpose of a particular business, or what is the need for a business before we jump to any size, scale, or location. And then above all, irrespective of any of this, they should be well-designed spaces that are more energizing, that are inspiring, and also just enable productivity as well. So if you look at like the size in terms of larger offices, these had been really, like actually the report also shows in 2001, we had more 19 square meter per desk, and now it has moved to 10 to 8 square meters per desk. Plus you have a long commute, plus a busy commute on top. So actually the experience has deteriorated. So we need to think that within the larger offices is what is that a company or a organization is looking for experience for their employees and visitors. So it will tend to become more open, more collaborative spaces. We'll have to think about like our core areas, circulation areas, and vertical circulation, and links between different elements of the office as well. But within a small and medium size, I can see that the buildings will tend to be more multi-let as well, which would mean that the shared areas become quite important. And it's actually interaction with the public realm and the outside is even key as well. In terms of location, I think it's, rather than what we've been talking about, like lots of different models, like hub and spoke, and lots of various other models as well, there will be like a central focus and a local focus. And the central, with both of them, I think the transport nodes play a very critical role, because within the central, there's the ease of accessibility, you attract a wider pool of talent. And then within the local, if the local area attracts the right pool of talent, because they might need smaller number of people, I can definitely see reason to stay local as well. And that's where we come into these more mixed use developments sort of what the research was also talking about is more promoting mixed use developments as well. So I think what it means for TfL's portfolio is actually it re-emphasizes our already underlying vision and strategy. So the property development TfL is focused on sustainable development. It's focused on customer and people, and also commercial astute as well. So it's interesting to know any investment that we or returns we get from our developments is reinvested back into the transport infrastructure as well. And then what we do is actually have got these guiding principles of our design for approach, design for sustainability, engagement, and affordable workplace as well. So one of our really key developments is Southwark Overstation, where we have enabled actually new council homes, and it's going to be one of the most greener and healthier buildings with well platinum enabled as well. And it'll be actually, as I understand, it'll be one of the first ones to directly use excess heat from the station as well. So yeah, it's quite exciting. I think I'm looking forward to what this new evolution of the offices phase is. Thank you, Peter.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Pooja. Now let's turn to Jeremy. So, Jeremy, how do you think working from home and the emergence of a sort of hybrid working will transform what is the sort of traditional office, and what are the emerging technologies that are going to enhance that?
Well, I think the first thing to say, Peter, is that from my perspective, because WRK is a kind of global network, and so we're getting soundings from other world cities, that this report actually reflects what's happening in London is very similar to what's happening in New York and Tokyo and other world cities. I think the hybrid world has arrived, and it's going to be enabled by technology. I think for me, I just want to make three very short points in response to the report. The first is about whether it's actually a revolution, because I noticed there was a caveat in Sarah's report where she put a question mark on the end of the title and said it was an acceleration of trends. And yes, it is an acceleration of existing trends, but what has happened over the last year is an incredible turnaround. And just in your own stats from your NLA Members Survey, before COVID, 84% of people were going to work in the office every day of the week. And in the future, 9%. 84 to 9%, that's an incredible switch. And what we're entering is a new world of work anywhere. It's a new model. In WRK Academy, we've called this new type of organization, a new type of workforce, choice champions, because they're going to decide whether they want to come into the office or not. And they are going to have their own workspace in the cloud. Wherever they work, they're going to be able to draw it down. So in a sense, the processes and technology of work are going to be divorced from the building. Which leads me on to my second point, and Sarah quoted me in the report, looking at the parallels between what's happened in retail with online shopping and what could happen with remote working. And we could be entering, in the same way that we have omni-channel retailing, there's more than one way to shop. You can go into a store, you can shop online, you can do click and collect. There are many channels, and the customer gets a seamless experience, whichever channel you choose. We could be entering a world in London where we have omni-channel working, where you've got lots of different channels through which you can work in a co-working space, in a flex space, in the corporate headquarters, at home, in a cafe. And you're drawing on the same technical infrastructure to do that. And what I believe is going to happen is that in order to attract people who have a choice whether they go to the office or not, offices are going to have to up their game, we're not going to have the same baseline, Sarah called it a generic fit out. We're going to see much more bespoke design. And there is a kind of retail offer coming into office design, whereby you make the office so cool with plants, with coffee, with amenities, that people will want to come to the office. And it's interesting that Tokyo and New York are very interested in the omni-channel working model, because they have traditionally long, troublesome, commuting cultures. And this idea, as Puja said, around working locally. And so if we're going into a parallel with retail, it brings me to my final point, which is about diversity and variety. And I noticed, Peter, that you quoted Frank Duffy in your introduction. You talked about a future office being richer and of wider variety, and you talked of the office as street, village, college, club. And I believe that is what is going to happen. We're going to see certainly headquarters buildings in central London. They're not going to be full of people sitting in rows of desks sending emails. That can be done elsewhere. When you go into a central London office now, you will go in for this kind of face-to-face activity. It'll be a place for purpose, a place to build culture, create networks, generate social capital. The things that people missed in the pandemic were the ability to learn over the shoulder, to innovate. You can't do a creative brainstorm successfully yet over the internet. And so what we're going to see is a future office, more bespoke, upscale in design, less desks, more collaboration and cafe spaces. And we're going to move away from amenity as a kind of corporate gym to amenity being value-based around things like flexibility and privacy. And obviously safety will be very important there. But I think this is a great report coming out at exactly the right time.
Great. Well, thank you, Jeremy. And now I'm going to move to Gwyn and ask really how's the city adapting to the sort of potential changes in design, development and management of offices? How are you responding to the omni-channel working, and which ones are, some are obviously temporary, but you've got to be thinking about the long term, haven't you, Gwyn?
I think I'd agree totally that this is an acceleration and a catalyst to changes which are happening already, because even before lockdown, you looked at the office in the city and there were hugely sustainability at its core, natural ventilation, external terrace. These are things which for many people are new phenomena. For us, they were being developed in schemes 2 to 3 years ago. The need for external terraces, celebrating cycling. I mean, one undershaft, which is what, 4 or 5 years ago, and Eric Parry with his ceremonial route celebrating cycling into the building. Now it was there before. Active travel celebrating the staircase instead of the kind of lifts and so on. Are actually becoming fun places to be, very informal, with incubation spaces and culturally enriching. So I think I would absolutely agree with this report. This is just an acceleration of those trends which were happening anyway, but now at an accelerated pace. And I think for me, the most positive thing about this report, it's reassuring because it confirms what we know as a city from our own research. We published London Recharged and Future City, and a lot of these kind of key elements are actually embedded within that. And I think at a time of uncertainty, when the dust was still settling, there was a lot of uninformed and cavalier speculation about the death of the office. I mean, I personally am not a great fan of the word office. I would prefer to be a workplace. An office has kind of relatively negative connotations, being an office worker. But I think this idea of going back to normality, we're not going back to normality. I think we're going back to a working environment which is much better than the one that we left. And I'm really feeling that kind of surge of optimism at the moment. And as a planner, the key thing for me is don't look at the office as an island, a building in a sea. The workplace is a place, which is, for example, example, the city. It's a combination of the buildings, blurring the definition between the buildings and the public realm and the retail and so on. So the office space is part of this kind of rich coral reef ecosystem of working in the city. You can create a lot of the things that this report advocates on an office building, but nobody's going to want to move to Solus Business Park. What happens in and around that piece of coral is absolutely critical to get people back into the city. And certainly what I'm feeling, there is an increased appetite to get back to the buzz of the city and merging that kind of definition between a workplace, leisure and fun and so on. I think my final point would be, it's been an economic tragedy the last year, but above all, it's been a humanity tragedy, a tragedy for people. And I think we need to come back, and office buildings have to be there. They need to be gentler, more humane, softer places for people. And this was a theme that was coming through a few years ago before COVID at the moment. So I think the new genre of workplaces that is developing, and which this report is very accurate in highlighting, will come back to a much more humane and gentle city, I think.
Great. Thank you very much, Gwyn. And yeah, so we look forward to coming back into a gentler city. And you've done a lot of work on walking and cycling in the City of London, really exemplar projects. And but your transport strategy was actually developed before COVID, wasn't it? And
Absolutely.
It did set out those plans anyway. So we look forward to seeing that actually implemented, particularly Bank Junction. And now we move to Andy Young, who's technical director of WRK Ingalls Group, or BIG. And Andy, I'd like to know from you, I mean, what do you see global trends are emerging around office design? Are current standards still relevant? And what's the opportunity for architects in this changing office landscape?
Thanks very much, Peter. Let me just say that this is the report that leads with a quote from Donald Rumsfeld. So I thought, crikey, Sarah must have cast the net pretty wide for the consultation on this one. But it does bring a lot of stuff together, and the timing is almost perfect here, because the statements that are put forward in the report, I think, do have a kind of a year's worth of maturity. And I think, as some of the other commentators have said, early days in this sort of revolution of working at home, there was a lot of stuff that was quite sensational that went out, say the office is dead, and the world is a completely different place, and so on. The report is very broad and matter of fact, rather than sort of zealously pursuing certain arguments, which I just think in this day and age, compared with mainstream media, is actually kind of quite a refreshing thing. And it makes the report kind of quite an easy read from that perspective. But of course, in being so matter of fact and a very measured piece of work, there's also what I would sort of, I suppose, suggest is that the reader takes a good look at this solid material and then tries to kind of pull out some scenarios. And during the consultation, we did pursue with your team a whole selection of scenarios to inform the content. And my mind goes back to discussions about the fact that early in the lockdown, we could imagine bosses of businesses all kind of thinking, crikey, my business is going to fall apart if everybody's not in the office, and so on. And then sometime later, 6 months later, those same bosses are sat in their country mansion in the conservatory, running a corporation off of a laptop, and getting Fortnum's to motor down a hamper when they get a bit hungry or they run out of Chardonnay or whatever. So it's kind of like there's an entirely changing, we've gone full circle in many respects. Also, thinking at it from the other end, the engine of any corporation, the workers, initially we looked at scenarios which was, it's going to be great, I don't have to sit next to Sheila anymore, there's going to be no commute for me, everything's going to be cool. And then later, it's all a bit like, well, I might not be missing Sheila, but I'd like to see Janet for a chat. And the youngsters all kind of saying, well, hang on a second, I'm on the up and up in my career. How on earth am I going to learn to be a governor of a corporation if I don't have any proximity to the leaders. And I think that, you know, what we've seen is that what's actually shown in the report in a relatively straightforward way is that kind of change which has occurred in people's attitudes. And then as a building designer, thinking about what that means is very, very interesting for me. So it's kind of, for me, the questions that the report brings up, particularly reference to how you could merge revolution or evolution with the climate emergency responses, has got a lot of stuff that it's not specifically stated in the report, but the thinking and the prompts are there for people to think. You know, for me, it's like, will grade A offices have loads of backup generators in future? Because if the electricity goes off, it's a perfectly adequate disaster recovery strategy. Just send everybody home like they did in March 2020. You know, we'll wait for the electricity board to come and change the fuse, and then everybody can come back on Wednesday, kind of thing. So do we really need in future buildings to be designed with these sort of diesel powered gas guzzling generators in the basement? And, you know, I do believe that what Gwyn said is actually true, and it's prompted again by the report to say that there were trends for designers to start thinking about the office in the city and in London generally as becoming a place where it's not just designed for people that are in business suits. You know, the generic office is one which sort of expects everybody to be rocking up in a twin set or a flashy suit, and that's what it's designed to kind of accept. And if you turn up with a bicycle, you know, the receptionist looks at you like you've got two heads. And for some time, actually, the design community has been reacting to that and trying to make, you know, experiences make it possible even for you to take a bicycle ride to a meeting and, you know, have everything catered for you. And the office building is actually kind of set up to deliver all of that stuff. So I think there is a certain element, as Gwyn said, which is just a kind of acceleration or further evolution of trends that were already out there, particularly for designers. But, you know, there is, in terms of this revolution and evolution thing, what I take from the report, you know, my particular reading of it is that, if you like, a revolution happened. Everybody didn't go to offices. That was a revolution in its own right. The evolution of, you know, how we respond to that when we're not told by the government to stay at home, that's the thing that's is happening now, and it's gonna go on for a bit. You know, does that lead to devolution of the headquarters, or, you know, any kind of ultimate solution which everybody adopts? Possibly not. I think maybe if there's a conclusion that can be drawn from the report, it's that the conclusion will be some time off. And, you know, how's it all going to be in the future? We don't know. Will it be good? Absolutely, yes, it will, is what I read. There'll be a diverse, massive range of responses that come from designers, building owners, occupiers, and all the rest of it. It's going to take time to settle, if indeed it does settle. But what I take from it is that it's a shake-up, and a disruption of old and you know, and stable things is often a good thing. It's happened. We're living in the aftermath. We make the best of it, and I suppose to be continued is how it should have ended.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Andy. And it's what the Rumsfeld quote. I put that in my introduction really because of the known unknowns and the unknown knowns. And as you say, you know, exactly how things are going to turn out is, you know, we still don't know precisely how people are going to respond to all sorts of things. How people are going to respond to getting back into the tube. How dense actually can you get people in the underground now? How will people feel comfortable? And you know, I think there are all sorts of things which we don't know. So we are still looking at how things will change in the future. And I mean, if we start with the first question, which we got from James Felstead, which is quite interesting in that respect, because and this might be one for Sarah, whether you came across, you know, are you aware of longer term research into home or remote working on efficiency, happiness, culture? I mean, what I mean, how well does it work in terms of both how well people are able to work and whether it is satisfying and good for their mental health?
Shall I take that one, Peter?
Yes, please.
I probably will need Jeremy's view on this as well, but in terms of the actual correlation between remote home working and the kind of wider cultural, social issues, that's a really good question. I kind of struggled to find that kind of longitudinal survey. And actually, this is probably the point at which people are starting to do that. As I was saying, our report is the starting point, and we certainly hope to revisit it in the future because, as people said, you know, so much massive change has happened. In general terms, there's obviously things like Richard Layard's work around happiness and social welfare. So it'd be really interesting to maybe look at that and see how it applies. The other thing, the point that we make in the report is that there's a huge amount of data. We're all used to seeing those kind of Chris Whitty graphs every day, or we were, but there's lots and lots of data, more than we've ever had before. So the great thing is historians in the future will be able to do those longer term surveys. But as for doing longitudinal surveys, yeah, it's quite difficult at the moment because, you know, it's in a state of constant flux, really, and uncertainty. But as I said, Jeremy might know some other work that's happening.
Ethnographic research done around home working, and we've just completed a study ourselves, supported by Intel, looking at European home workers. But there aren't the longitudinal studies of home working. It has been a kind of fringe activity, and now I think academic research will look at it much more closely because it's very much part of the mainstream of work. You know, compared to how much research has been done on behaviour and the design of offices, home working's been relatively neglected. But I know the name Felsted rings a big bell with me in the research field. So I think our questioner has plenty of knowledge.
Thank you very much. Now, Pooja, here's a question from Andrew Dakers, who says, how do we avoid everyone flooding into the office with purpose Tuesdays and Wednesdays, creating a huge peak pressure on transport network 3 days a week, and everyone presumably may be hoping to take long weekends. But also, then Julio suggests that with potential localization of work, there's likely reduction of commuting, but as a result, there's another risk of huge increase in leisure trips, less likely to be predictable, threatening the environment's benefit of reduced commuting. Do you have a response to those two questions, or either of them?
Sure. I think this sort of question has sort of existed, or concept has existed for a while now, where we certainly see on Fridays, this is pre-pandemic, on Fridays that the office was emptier than on Mondays when everybody had the meetings. So, but then that was always on public transport, balanced by an influx of tourists or other visitors as well, traveling locally. There are children, the tube is used really widely by people in education as well. So I think the data that has come out very recently on the ridership, just after the ease of this new lockdown, and it's only been 2 days, is that tube right now is 40% of its capacity. And then the buses are running at around 60% of the capacity. But how do we tackle that there is a peak? I think it really is down to about flexibility as well, in terms of the peak working hours. Are they going to remain as 9 to 5, or are they going to become a little bit more flexible? I mean, I was lucky enough that I had these flexible hours from before, for example, to incorporate my pickups or drop-offs. And so I think these sort of working behaviors are going to get more accepted as a norm. So hopefully everybody might not want to be on their desk at 9 and leave at 5. So that will help with ease some of the pressure. And then obviously we'll have to see how when we are fully open, how with the influx of tourists and leisure affects the transport network. But I hope a lot of the leisure activities might now start happening more on cycles and walking as well. So there is a big influx of electric bikes that we see on streets. And I think that trend is going to grow as well. So that should also help with balance how we commute.
Thank you. And now one for Gwyn. I think Peter Reed says, buildings have a natural longevity, so what can be done with the vast proportion of current stock that is hard to reconfigure in the context that if 55% hope to be office-based 2 to 3 days per week. So reducing total space needs quite dramatically.
I think we need to build flexibility within those uses, within the office building, for a lot more hyper retail, as you'll see from a lot of the consents that we've issued. A lot of these will have elevated public areas with bars, restaurants, and cafes and so on to build in that flexibility. We're also doing a lot of work with the development industry to make sure that those buildings are deconstructible and adaptable to changes. In terms of the embedded carbon and the reuse of those buildings as well. So it's building up that kind of hyper flexibility for those buildings and to look creatively at complementary uses for the main purpose of those buildings as workplaces.
And Andy, perhaps I can follow up this question from Doriano Chiaparin, who asks, you know, what can attract us back to the office? Traditional model of hard occupant number, soft ancillary space needs to be turned on its head. To make commuting to the office worthwhile, we need to create conditions for the spontaneous, accidental, serendipitous encounters that foster creativity. So is that the new brief for the office space?
Thanks, Peter. Yes, I mean, I think, yeah, that's part of it, for sure. I mean, the new workplace has to be interesting in the context of the occupier and the organisation that one works for, I would say. So it will be very different, I assume, in a lawyer's office from, say, I don't know, graphic design office or whatever. Different needs for different occupiers. There's a lot of work that will be quite easily accommodated in a working from home environment, but there's a lot of other work types that simply don't suit that, or we'll have to adapt more. So yes, it's definitely going to be part of the brief for buildings and workplaces going forward. I think that there's a lot of other issues that come into it as well, which some of those are a little bit more kind of dry, as it were, like kind of what is the actual thing that you're making. Also, the business of location. I mean, I think Gwyn spoke about it momentarily, which was to say the place where you work is not just the office building, you know, the kind of beautiful, hermetically sealed, gorgeous show-off environment that your employers provided for you, but it's also, you know, what's immediately outside. Is there a nice sandwich shop down the road? You know, what's available in the evening, you know, what's happening, what is the actual kind of location? And so I think it's perhaps a little bit broader than that, because just providing a whole bunch of cool workspace in local environments might not satisfy certainly ambitious people's needs for a great working life. So I think probably, yes, all of those things are factors that must be included in any brief for a workplace. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the way that the whole metropolitan area, but focusing on London, it will be also to do with, you know, how the context of the workplace physically is responding as well.
Thank you very much. Yes, well, Vicky Evans asks, any evidence of a rush to new fit outs, spending money and time on redesigning workspaces to create more collaborative areas, or is it wait and see? Jeremy, what do you think around that, and perhaps also respond to that point I put to Andy about the brief for the future workplace? I mean, if you were writing a brief now, how do you create a brief, designer?
Yeah, I think there is evidence that offices are not going to spring back into their old model, and what we're seeing is a WRK Academy. We've just done a survey with European corporate real estate people, and big banks across Europe are now thinking about, they're still going to have desks, but they're going to spread them out because of COVID and because of social distancing. But they're going to have less desks. They're going to have more hybrid working. Offices are, in the terms of one head of workplace, they're going to go upscale in terms of design. They're going to have more cafe and collaboration areas. And I think there has been a wait and see. Element, but I think companies are beginning to move. There's something we've identified which we call resolute returners, and I think Goldman Sachs would be the top of that list, saying, you know, remote working's an aberration. We've got to get everybody back in the office. And the workforce is saying to them, well, if you want us back in the office 5 days a week, we want a different office. We want a better workplace. So I think we are seeing change on that level. In terms of a brief, Peter, I think all of the things that I've mentioned around the need to facilitate collaboration, innovation, learning, make it easier for over-the-shoulder mentoring, but also in terms of meetings, people are talking about something called digital equality, so that the people who are joining the meeting remotely have the same experience as those who are in the room. And that means we've got to get away from the horrible glass box with the table and the screen in the corner. We've all been on Zoom calls where we've not been able to make a meeting, and you just, you know, you have no agency in that meeting. You can't get your voice heard. You're this disembodied postage stamp in the corner of the room. We're going to have to reconfigure what meeting rooms look like. And there's been some very interesting work coming out of Microsoft, where they've been working with various design firms in the US to rethink the meeting room, and it does look very different.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's have a look at that. I was in a meeting exactly like that yesterday, where some poor chap was sitting on the wall all the time and hardly said a thing. But you're absolutely right. And I think Pooja talked about more flexible timing of work, which and it's always astonished me that, you know, one in office, we have an office where there are quite a lot of people with young children, and you know, that sort of 9 o'clock rush, even to get to a Zoom meeting, is always seems to be incredibly frenetic because of the sort of tend to fixed times in offices. So Greta Farren says, have there been any studies into the benefits of creche provision in offices? I mean, Sarah, did you come across that in, you know, the idea that you actually, that the office can accommodate other aspects of home, not just working from home, as it were?
That's a really good question. I didn't find anything kind of specific, but I think it's part of this, as other people have said, you know, thinking more creatively about those extra amenity spaces that will be needed. And the point that we've tried to make in 2016 and in 2021 about making sure buildings can flex between different uses, and making sure that all those potential needs can be accommodated in some way, in a smarter way. So I think it's part of that wider issue.
So Pooja, do you think TfL will actually encourage more flexible working? I mean, in the 19th century, of course, there was a sort of 1 penny underground journeys for people who wanted to get to work early in the morning before the main rush, and that did actually it created a sort of 2-tier system, but it was actually something which encouraged a much broader use and reduced rush hours.
Peter, I'm not aware of any drastic measures in terms of the ticketing pricing that will come out of this, the whole change in our working behavior. But I think I think if you look at office or a workplace, whatever word you want to use, it's more like an enabler. It creates an environment, but actually it's giving you a space to collaborate. But actually, really the culture of how you wish to collaborate has to be created by the people there itself. So the people are the most critical ingredient of making any workplace a success. They can be amenities provided and everything there, but that's the key element. I was speaking to one of my colleagues the other day, and we were saying it's interesting you mentioning creche, but actually they were also going beyond and saying, actually, what about the pets now? Because there's been a big boom of pets during the pandemic, and then they were actually looking forward to having flexible working so that they can spend some time with the pet as well and not have to be in the office all 5 days a week. So I think it's really about companies to think, if they really put people, human, at the center of this evolution, I think we will get it right.
Good. Okay, now there's a question here, which I think perhaps aimed at Gwyn. Anonymous attendee says, in the FT today, they say that London offices risk becoming stranded assets because they don't meet environmental standards. Should we be concerned?
I think we shouldn't be concerned because we're absolutely onto this in the city and working with the GLA and with our climate action strategy. One of the key elements of negotiating new schemes is sustainability credentials, from whole life carbon to embedded carbon, so on. So we're absolutely committed to generating a new generation of buildings which are fit for purpose in terms of sustainability and will endure. So I think that the radical changes that have happened in the last year in terms of COVID is absolutely reflected in a real shift change in awareness, both at the development level and on planning authorities level on sustainability. So I think we're doing fairly radical things on that front.
Good, thank you very much. Well, we are just about up to time, I'm afraid. So thank you very much to our panels for a report. Thank you, Sarah, for your hard work on producing this very, very important document. And there have been questions in the Q&A panel about downloading it. So yes, you can download it from our website, which is nla.london. And that's available now. And we're going to be continuing this discussion around future workplaces really over, well, next year or maybe longer into the future. And our next discussion will be as a part of our Nylon, our New York-London debate. And that's taking place on June the 8th. And you can register online that to compare what's going on in the Big Apple with London's experience. So I'm looking forward to that. And you will see coming up on your screens in a moment a short poll to give us a bit of feedback on today's sessions. We'd be very, very grateful if you'd fill that in, because it just helps us to make sure we're getting the program right and take on board your comments. So thank you very much to our excellent panel, and thank you all for watching. Bye.